You have to understand, my life in Atlanta was curated. From the outside, it was perfect. I was Hadley Harris, a rising star in a cutthroat finance firm, the kind of woman who commanded boardrooms and closed multi-million-dollar deals before lunch. My LinkedIn profile was a testament to ambition and success. My apartment was a sleek, minimalist sanctuary in the sky, all glass and chrome, overlooking the city lights. It was a life I had built myself, brick by painful brick. And then there was the other side of the coin, the Harris family, owners of the prestigious Harris boutique hotel chain, a name that dripped old money and Southern charm. To the world, we were the picture of dynastic perfection, but inside those gilded walls, I was the family's ghost. It had always been that way. My parents, Richard and Eleanor Harris, operated on a simple binary system. There was Lucas, and then there was me. Lucas was the golden child, the heir apparent. He could do no wrong, even when everything he did was wrong. He'd flunked out of 2 universities, but they called it finding himself. He'd crashed a vintage Porsche, and they'd bought him a newer one. His business ventures, a disastrous crypto scheme, a failed line of artisanal dog water, were funded without a second thought, draining capital from the company I knew they should have been reinvesting. He was charming, handsome, and utterly useless, and my parents adored him for it. Me, I was the spare part, the overachiever. My straight A's were met with a distracted nod. My promotion to vice president at my firm earned me a lukewarm, "Oh, that's nice, dear," over the phone before my mother immediately pivoted to Lucas's latest drama. They saw my independence not as a strength, but as an affront, as if my success was a quiet judgment on their coddling of my brother. I worked twice as hard for half the recognition. Fueled by a stubborn refusal to be the failure they seemed to expect me to be, I didn't need their help, and I made damn sure I never had to ask for it. The only person in that entire family who ever truly saw me was my grandfather, Arthur Harris. He was the patriarch, the man who had built the Harris Hotel empire from a single, charming guest house into a nationwide symbol of luxury. He was old school, tough as nails, with a core of integrity that seemed to have skipped a generation. He saw the fire in me, the same drive that had fueled him. He'd pull me aside at stuffy family gatherings, his eyes twinkling. "Don't you ever let them dim your shine, Hadley." He'd say, his voice a low rumble, "You're the one who got the good stuff." The grit. When Lucas and I turned 21, Grandpa Arthur set up a trust fund for each of us. $5 million. It was a staggering sum, a safety net and a launch pad. Lucas, predictably, started chipping away at his immediately for cars, parties, and every bad idea that floated through his head. I, on the other hand, treated mine like a sacred vow. I never touched a dime of it. It was my emergency button, my proof of his faith in me. In a family that gave me nothing, my grandfather's trust was the only inheritance I truly valued. I never imagined the people I was supposed to trust most would be the ones to detonate it. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I was in my office, staring down the final details of a massive merger deal I'd been working on for 6 months. This deal wasn't just a career move, it was my masterpiece. It would cement my reputation and put me on the fast track to a partnership. My bags were packed for a flight to London that afternoon to finalize everything. My phone buzzed, flashing. Mom. I almost ignored it. Our conversations were usually so vapid they could float. But something made me answer. "Hadley?" My mother's voice was thin and tight with a panic I hadn't heard since Lucas got arrested for trying to pay for a jet ski with a counterfeit check. "It's your grandfather. He's had a fall. A bad one." The doctors, they don't think he has much time? The world tilted. My meticulously planned day, my career-defining deal, all of it evaporated. All I could see was my grandfather's kind, wrinkled face. The man who was my only anchor in a sea of familial indifference. "I'm on my way," I said, my voice hollow. I called my assistant, canceled the London trip, delegating the final critical steps to a junior colleague I prayed wouldn't screw it up. I threw a weekend bag into my car and drove the 2 hours from Atlanta to the family estate in a haze of dread. I rehearsed my goodbyes, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. I braced myself for the hushed tones of a hospital room, the sterile smell of antiseptic, the sight of my grandfather, diminished and frail. What I found was silence. The sprawling family home was empty. No cars in the driveway except for the housekeeper's sedan. No grim-faced relatives huddled in the living room. My mother's car was gone. My father's was gone. Lucas's ridiculous, canary yellow sports car was gone. A cold knot of confusion tightened in my gut. I used my key and stepped inside. The house was pristine, eerily quiet. A note was propped up on the polished mahogany of the entryway table. It wasn't in my mother's frantic scrawl. It was in the calm, neat cursive of Mrs. Gable, our housekeeper for over 30 years. "Hadley, your mother asked me to leave this for you. They had a last-minute family emergency and had to fly out. She said you'd understand. They'll call you when they land. P.S. I hope your grandfather is feeling better soon." She seemed so worried about his fall when she called me this morning to make sure the house was ready for your arrival. The paper trembled in my hand. A family emergency? I was here for the family emergency. And why would my mother call the housekeeper about Grandpa's fall? It made no sense. I pulled out my phone, my thumb hovering over my mother's number, but then a different instinct took over. I called the one person who would know everything. "Harris Residence." A familiar voice answered. It wasn't a nurse or a doctor. It was my grandfather. And he didn't sound weak or dying. He sounded like he was halfway through a crossword puzzle and a cup of coffee. "Grandpa?" My voice was a choked whisper. "Hadley, what a surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure, kiddo?" "The fall," I stammered. "Mom said you had a terrible fall, that you worried that you were dying." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the rustle of a newspaper. Then a deep, wary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 100 disappointments. "Oh, Hadley," he said, and the sadness in his voice broke my heart more than the lie itself. "There was no fall. I'm fine. I'm sitting right here on my porch. Your parents, they took Lucas to the Bahamas. They left this morning." The lie was so audacious, so cruel, it knocked the wind out of me. I sank onto the bottom step of the grand staircase, the cold marble seeping through my clothes. They faked my grandfather's death. They weaponized my love for the one man who cared about me just to get me out of the way. To go on a family vacation, a vacation I, once again, was not invited to. They didn't just exclude me. They orchestrated a piece of psychological torture to ensure I wouldn't interfere with their perfect little family getaway. The pain was sharp and visceral, but it was quickly followed by a cold, clarifying rage. This wasn't just another casual slight. This was a declaration of war. They had finally made it clear, in the most brutal way imaginable, that I was not just an afterthought. I was an obstacle. Something to be managed, to be deceived, to be gotten rid of. That night, alone in that cavernous, empty house, the confirmation I didn't even know I was waiting for popped up on my phone. It was a notification from Instagram. My brother Lucas had posted a new photo. There they were, my mother, my father, and Lucas all tanned and beaming on a white sand beach, holding cocktails with little paper umbrellas. My father had his arms slung around Lucas, a look of idiotic paternal pride on his face. The caption read, "Nothing better than a spontaneous trip with the ones that matter most." A family first, a Bahamas Life Harris family. The ones that matter most. The hashtag felt like a punch to the gut. I scrolled through the comments. Sycophantic friends of my parents and Lucas's brain-dead followers were flooding the post. "Looks amazing. So jealous. The perfect family." Each comment was another twist of the knife. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, hot with shame and fury. I wasn't just sad anymore. I was done. Done being the family doormat, done pretending their approval mattered. Done being their ghost. The next day, I drove back to my grandfather's house, a historic property a few miles from the main family estate. I found him on the veranda, overlooking his immaculate rose garden. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, the lines on his face etched with a profound sorrow. "They've gone too far this time, Arthur," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. I never called him Arthur. He nodded slowly, not looking at me. "I know, Hadley. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I've let this go on for too long. My silence has made me complicit." "What do you mean?" He finally turned to face me and his eyes were glistening. "There's more, Hadley. The Bahamas trip, it's just the tip of the iceberg. It's what they're doing while there that you need to know about." He led me into his study, a room that smelled of old books, leather, and cedar. From a locked drawer in his massive oak desk, he pulled out a thick file folder. He slid it across the polished surface towards me. "These are bank statements from your trust." I opened the folder. The first page was a summary. The starting balancing, $5,000. The current balancing, $47, 2016. I couldn't breathe. My vision swam. It had to be a mistake, a typo. I flipped through the pages, a decade's worth of statements. There were hundreds of withdrawals, ranging from a few $1,000s to staggering sums of over $100,000 at a time. Transfers to offshore accounts. Payments to luxury car dealerships. Wires to cover credit card bills filled with charges from places like Guxy, Rolex, and five-star resorts I'd never even heard of. "How?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "How is this possible? My signature is required for any withdrawal. Your father is the trustee," Grandpa said, his voice grim. "He has administrative control. Years ago, he had you sign a stack of documents, told you it was just routine estate planning paperwork. One of those papers gave him power of attorney over the trust in case of a financial emergency. He's been manufacturing emergencies for Lucas ever since. They had been systematically bleeding me dry for a decade. Every lavish party for Lucas, every failed business, every designer watch. I had paid for it. My safety net, the symbol of my grandfather's belief in me, had been used as their personal slush fund to prop up my worthless brother. The cruelty was breathtaking. They didn't just neglect me. They actively stole from me to fund the life of the child they preferred. But my grandfather wasn't finished. He slid another document across the desk. This one was a corporate filing. "This is the real reason for the trip," he said. "They're in the Bahamas to sign the final papers. They've restructured the entire Harris Hotel's holding company. They're transferring 100% of the ownership shares into a new shell corporation registered to Lucas." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. They weren't just stealing my past. They were stealing my future. The company my grandfather had built, the legacy I had secretly hoped I might one day have a part in, was being handed over to my feckless brother. I was being written out of the family history entirely. That was the moment something inside me snapped. The grief, the hurt, the years of quiet resentment, they all burned away, leaving behind something hard and sharp and utterly cold. There would be no more tears. There would be no more quiet suffering. There would only be retribution. They made a mistake, Grandpa, I said, my voice dangerously calm as I looked up from the documents. They thought I was a ghost. They're about to find out I'm a poltergeist. And I'm going to burn their house down. For the first time that day, a glimmer of the fire returned to my grandfather's eyes. A slow, grim smile spread across his face. Good, he rumbled, because I know exactly where they keep the matches. My first call was to my Aunt Julia. Julia was my mother's sister, but they were night and day. Where my mother was soft, manipulative, and obsessed with appearances, Julia was sharp, direct, and had the backbone of a steel girder. She was also one of the most feared corporate lawyers in the state. We weren't close. My parents had made sure of that, painting her as a cold-hearted workaholic, but I knew if anyone would appreciate the strategic beauty of vengeance, it would be her. I met her at her downtown office, a place of imposing glass walls and panoramic city views. I laid out the whole sordid story, the faked death, the drained trust fund, the secret transfer of the company. I handed her the files my grandfather had given me. She listened without interruption, her face an unreadable mask, her fingers steepled under her chin. When I finished, she was silent for a full minute. Then she looked at me, a glint in her eye that was pure predator. Well, Hadley, she said, a smile spreading across her face. It seems my sister and her useless husband have finally committed a crime stupid enough to be interesting. Embezzlement, wire fraud, conspiracy, it's a beautiful trifecta. Can we stop them? I asked, my voice tight. Stop them. Julia laughed, a short, sharp sound. Honey, we're not going to stop them. We're going to let them walk right into the trap. Then we're going to annihilate them. Legally, of course. Her plan was elegant in its simplicity and brutal in its execution. Step 1 was public humiliation. Step 2 was legal strangulation. Your parents care about one thing above all else, their reputation. Julia explained, pacing in front of her window. The illusion of the perfect, powerful Harris family. We're going to shatter that illusion into a million pieces. That evening, I sat at my laptop, my heart pounding in my chest. With Julia and Grandpa Arthur's input, I had drafted a post for Instagram. It was my turn to use the platform they'd used to mock me. I chose a picture of myself, a professional headshot where I looked strong, confident, and then in control. And then I wrote the caption, some truths about the Harris family. For the past decade, my parents, Richard and Eleanor Harris, have been illegally embezzling millions from my trust fund to finance my brother Lucas's lifestyle. This week, they faked my grandfather's imminent death to trick me into abandoning my career obligations so they could take a family first vacation to the Bahamas. The real purpose of this trip is to sign documents that will fraudulently transfer 100% of the Harris Hotel's empire, a company built by my grandfather, into my brother's name, effectively stealing my birthright. I am no longer staying silent. The Harris family you see on social media is a lie. This is a story of theft, greed, and betrayal. If Harry sees family fraud, justice for Hadley, I attached a key documents my grandfather had scanned for me, the trust fund summary showing the $5 million balance, reduced to nothing, and the public filing for the new shell corporation in Lucas's name. My finger hovered over the share button. This was the point of no return. I took a deep breath and pressed it. The explosion was instantaneous. Within 10 minutes, my phone was vibrating so hard it nearly fell off the table. Friends, former colleagues, distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years. The post was shared dozens, then hundreds of times. Local Atlanta news blogs picked it up. The story was too juicy to ignoring. A prominent family, a secret betrayal, a whistleblower from the inside. By the next morning, it was a full-blown media firestorm. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution had a reporter digging into the corporate filings. Financial news outlets began sniffing around the edges of Harris Hotels, a privately held company that was now facing a very public and very ugly scandal. The comments on my parents and Lucas's vacation photos turned from fawning praise to a torrent of outrage and disgust. While the court of public opinion was in session, Julia was working the legal angles with surgical precision. She filed an emergency injunction to freeze any transfer of company assets, citing evidence of fraud. The motion was granted, meaning that even if my parents signed the papers in the Bahamas, the deal would be dead on arrival. The best part, however, came from my grandfather. He called me, his voice filled with a grim satisfaction I'd never heard before. "I found it, Hadley," he said, "the silver bullet." He explained that when he'd reluctantly handed over day control of the company to my father 20 years ago, his lawyers had insisted on a failsafe. Buried deep in the fine print of the original partnership agreement was a clause, what he called the integrity clause. It stated that if the acting CEO, my father, was ever found to have engaged in gross financial misconduct or fraudulent activity that threatened the reputation or stability of the company, full controlling interest and all voting shares would immediately revert back to the original founder, Arthur Harris. My father had signed it without a thought. Arrogant and secure in his position, he had forgotten it even existed. But my grandfather had a copy, notarized and locked away in a safe deposit box for 2 decades, waiting. They didn't just steal your money, Hadley. Grandpa said, a low chuckle in his throat. They handed us the keys to the entire kingdom. The prodigal family returned from the Bahamas 2 days later, not to a hero's welcome, but to a maelstrom. They landed to find their phones blown up with notifications, their lawyers in a panic, and their names being dragged through the mud on every local news channel. Their tans couldn't hide the pallor of fear that had set in. The confrontation was set. Julia had arranged it. We would meet them at the Harris Hotel's corporate headquarters. They thought they were coming for a cease and desist discussion with my lawyer. They had no idea they were walking into their own execution. I walked into the main boardroom first. It was a space designed to intimidate, with a ridiculously long mahogany table and floor to ceiling windows overlooking the city. My father was already there, pacing like a caged animal, his face a mottled red. My mother sat at the table, her face pale and drawn, trying to project an aura of wounded dignity that wasn't fooling anyone. Lucas was slumped in a chair in the corner, staring at his phone, looking like a petulant child who'd had his favorite toy taken away. Hadley. My father barked, his voice dripping with venom. What is the meaning of this? Airing our private family business in public. You have ruined us. I ruined you. I let out a short, incredulous laugh. You faked a man's death. You stole $5 million from me. You tried to steal a $500 million company. You didn't need my help to ruin you. You did it all on your own. That money was for the family. My mother chimed in, her voice trembling with self-pity. Lucas needed it. He has so much potential. You have your own career. You never needed that money. Whether I needed it or not is irrelevant. I shot back, my voice as cold as ice. It was mine. And you are thieves. It's done. Hadley, my father sneered, regaining a sliver of his usual arrogance. We signed the papers. The company belongs to Lucas now? Your little social media stunt is just a tantrum. You have nothing? That was my cue. I smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach my eyes. You're right. I have nothing, except, of course, this. I slid a single piece of paper across the vast table. It was a copy of the original partnership agreement with integrity clause highlighted in bright yellow. My father snatched it up. I watched as his eyes scanned the page, his face draining of all color. He looked up, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, no sound coming out. You seem to have forgotten this little detail, I said calmly. Grandpa didn't. Your years of embezzlement, culminating in this fraudulent transfer, I'd say that qualifies as a gross financial misconduct. Wouldn't you, Dad? My mother looked from my father's horrified face to me, her eyes wide with confusion. Richard, what is she talking about? Before he could answer, the boardroom doors swung open. Two men in dark suits, flanking my Aunt Julia, stepped into the room. They flashed their badges. Richard and Eleanor Harris. One of the men said, his voice flat and official. We're with the FBI. You're under arrest for wire fraud and conspiracy. As they snapped handcuffs on my stunned parents, my grandfather walked into the room. He didn't look at his son or his daughter-in-law. He walked straight to the head of the table and sat down. He looked at Lucas, who was now staring, slack-jawed, at the scene unfolding. Get out of my building, boy, Grandpa said, his voice a low command. Lucas, for the first time in his life, did as he was told without a word, scrambling out of the room like the coward he was. The fallout was swift and absolute. The court case was a slam dunk. With the mountain of evidence Julia and I had compiled, my parents had no choice but to plead guilty to a host of federal charges. The fraudulent transfer of the company to Lucas was declared null and void. Faced with long prison sentences, they agreed to a dealing they would sign over every remaining asset they had, and in return, the prosecutors would recommend a lighter sentence. They still got jail time, but their empire was gone. And as per the integrity clause, with my father convicted of financial fraud, 100% of the controlling shares of Harris Hotels reverted to my grandfather. The very next day, in his lawyer's office, he signed them all over to me. It's yours now. Hadley, he said, his hand covering mine on the table. It always should have been. Taking over was like trying to right a capsized ship in the middle of a hurricane. My father had been running the company into the ground. He'd been using company funds as his personal piggy bank, cutting corners and bleeding the staff dry. Morale was at an all-time low. There were unpaid vendors, delayed paychecks for loyal employees, and a brand reputation that was now in tatters. But I wasn't my father. My first act as CEO was to call an all-hands meeting. I stood before the entire corporate staff and laid out the unvarnished truth of what my parents had done. And then I made them a promise. I used my own money. Money from the liquidated assets of my parents that the court had ordered as restitution to pay every single cent of back pay and bonuses that were owed. I announced a new, transparent accounting policy. I established a scholarship fund for the children of our employees, funded by what was left of my parents' personal fortune. It was a long, arduous process. We had to rebuild trust with our employees, our vendors, and our guests. But slowly we did. I poured my life into that company, not just with the sharp financial mind I'd honed in my previous career, but with the integrity my grandfather had instilled in me. I wasn't just rebuilding a business, I was restoring a legacy. 6 months later, I was standing with my grandfather on the rooftop terrace of our flagship hotel in Atlanta. The sun was setting, painting the skyline in hues of orange and purple. The hotel was buzzing with life below us, more successful and more respected than it had been in decades. "You did it, kiddo," Grandpa said, squeezing my shoulder. "You took the ugliest parts of this family and built something beautiful." I looked out at the city, my city. My parents had tried to make me a ghost in my own family, an invisible footnote in their story. They had faked a death to build a lie. But in the end, I had taken their lies and turned them into my truth. I was no ghost. I was Hadley Harris, and this was my empire, built not on a foundation of deceit, but from the ashes of a spectacular revenge. And the view from the top was even better than I had ever imagined.